Welcome back as we continue our conversation on Leviticus. In the previous video, we kind of ended with this question of how can we be redeemed. So we have chapter 24 talked about, we've had all these things on holiness for chapter after chapter after chapter. This guy blasphemes the name in chapter 24, verse 11, and he is stoned to death. He's getting this communal punishment. The whole community comes and stones him. This is what God says to do. This is his punishment for not following God's commands, for not being holy as he is supposed to. But we need to instead follow God's commands. We need to be holy. And we get a picture of what the ramifications positively for that are. In chapter 25, we have a Sabbath year, 1 year and 7 years. So you have 6 years of working, and then a seventh year is a year of rest for the land. So it's not just rest for people, rest even for the land. So give the land a year to rest. This is super important for later on. We'll see 800 years later that God says, hey, part of the reason I'm kicking you out of the land is because you didn't do this. This land is supposed to rest every 7 years. And then once you had seven of these cycles of seven, then that's 49 years. Then you have a 50th year. That's the year of Jubilee. And that is a real celebration. That's freedom for everyone. All the Israelites, all their land, like if you've sold land that was your inheritance land, comes back to you at the year of Jubilee. Or maybe your dad sold the land, your dad's dead now, and it would have been your land, it comes to you now. So you get your land back. If you sold yourself as a servant to other Israelites, you're free. This is a year of freedom, the year of Jubilee. It's pointing to Jesus, as he read in Isaiah when he was in a synagogue, that he was the one that was inaugurating this freedom. So this is all pointing to a spiritual truth of Jesus redeeming and freeing people. So I don't think this ever happened with the Israelites. There's no indication that it did, that they ever actually followed through with this, but they should have. That is what God told them to do. There was this time of freedom for everyone. Everyone was released, and it's what's supposed to have happened. The one time that they kind of did it, God spared them from some disaster because they said, okay, well, yeah, we were supposed to let people go and we're going to do that. Then as soon as the disaster was averted, then they went back and took them all back and said, actually, no, you don't get to be free. And God immediately judged them for that. So clearly, this is something they're supposed to do, not something that they did do, and they got judged for that. But it's not just this 1 in 50 years kind of thing. There is this process of redemption that's even more expansive than that we see right after that. How these Israelites, if you did have to sell your land, if you did have to even sell yourself, how could you be what's called redeemed? How could you be freed? How could your land be, you could say, freed? There was a process for that. For your land of inheritance, for if you had to sell yourself because you were poor, and so you're going to have to be working for a certain amount of time, then you actually could have somebody else redeem you. And we actually see something along those lines, something that involves this redemption process in the book of Ruth. But ultimately, this points us to Jesus. So we've had these chapters on holiness, but then we saw an example of a guy not following that, and we see that points to judgment. Right? There's judgment. And you have, right after that, the eye for an eye passage we referred to, that it is talking about judgment. So there's a just judgment coming for those who do not live up to the standard, which is all of us. So you have that just judgment pointing to eternal judgment. But you also have the Sabbath year. You have year of Jubilee pointing to eternal blessing. And which path are you going down? We're all going down the judgment one. We need to be redeemed. And so it immediately then tells us redemption. These physical examples points us to the spiritual truth of being redeemed, being able to be in that eternal blessing that it just spoke about, like the year of Jubilee. We have this, it's not a narrative, but kind of feels like a narrative of the story of where things are going and pointing forward to Jesus and what he does for us and how he can redeem us, and we can have this eternal blessing and be part of that rather than the eternal judgment that we deserve. And then we get to a part which I know is going to be really difficult for people. It was difficult for me as I initially read through it. You see this stuff about servants in particularly chapter 25, verses 39 through 46. And in this section, there's a couple things that could be really sticky for some of us. Now, just to note right at the beginning, at least in the ESV, it alternates between saying servant or slave. These are the same word in the Hebrew. So we have verse 42. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. The word slave, replace it with the word servant. It's the same word that you just saw at the beginning of the verse. Both of those, servant and slave, is the same word, servant. I've talked about this previous video. I'll link in the description below about servanthood. I've addressed it from the standpoint of Exodus, because Exodus talked about it. So when Exodus got there, we talked about it in Exodus. Now I'm going to talk about it as it's addressed in Leviticus. And then when we get to other passages later on in the Bible, we'll address it there as well. Focusing just on this passage right here, though. So servanthood is a much better way to phrase that, because when we hear slave, like there's just so much baggage that comes with that word. And it's so easy, so natural just to think about things that were, relatively speaking, especially compared to this, like pretty recently. In just the past couple hundred years, like not even that long. Like this is in America. There's other places, it may be an even different story, but in America you had this slavery that was evil, that was based upon stealing, which is forbidden in Exodus, based upon race, so it's a racism issue as well. There's so many problems, so many evils going on with what we are familiar with. That's slavery. This is not the same as that. And again, I've talked about that in a previous video. But here, the two issues that I think maybe the two primary issues that we may have here with it is, first of all, it does say that there are these other people that can be servants from the surrounding areas that you can get that aren't Israelites. They're not part of the covenant community. And it says, they may be your property. That's verse 45. And it also then says, at the end of verse 46, you may make slaves or servants of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. So does that imply that you can be ruthless with these other people? Well, what you've got here, these two issues, take the first one being the property. In order to understand this, we've got to understand context. Because it is, if you want to like have a problem with the Bible, you can go isolate any verse you want, go pick it out and just say, aha! And there are people who want to do that. They just want to be upset at the Bible. They just want to find a gotcha moment. And they're not really interested in knowing the truth. They're not really interested in knowing actually what the Bible says. There are people who will say, hey, I want to learn about the Bible, and they just still disagree with it, and they genuinely want to learn, and they just disagree. But there are other people who they don't like it. It's an emotional response at the end of the day. They don't like it. They don't want it. They're just going to find anything they can to complain about. And so it's very easy to take a verse and say, this verse sounds bad. I don't like it. This is a bad thing. But if you're genuine, if you're like, hey, I'm really trying to learn about this. I really want to know, why would it say that someone can be property? Because we're automatically going to say we think that's bad. Now, first question is, why do you think it's bad? Do you have a reason? Or is it just, you just kind of know it's bad? Like, that's just an automatic, of course that's bad. If you can't figure out exactly where you get that from, probably where this idea comes from, because this is not a universal idea that someone being someone else's property is bad. There's many places and many times where that wasn't considered the case. It actually stems a lot from the Bible, from this idea that we're made in God's image. And we kind of lost the roots of why we think that we have to take care of other people and stuff like that even. That we have to look out for the poor. This is from the Bible. This was not a common thing. You go look at the Roman Empire, they didn't care about the poor, or they'd even say like, oh, I had a baby girl, like toss her out, I don't need that, I just want a boy, right? And the Christians would come along and say, no, you got to take care of everyone, and they'd go take those little girls and they go raise them in their own homes. And so they were the ones that kind of had this idea of you got to care for other people, and so it wasn't about getting something for yourself, it was about taking care of others. But this idea of property, when we think of property, maybe not be the same idea as what the Bible says. So how does the Bible use the word property? What does it mean by this? What does it mean that someone can be someone else's property? Well, let's look at the word in the same context, same chapter. So we have in chapter 25, verse 28, this is talking about redemption, because that's the theme here. All right, remember what's the actual point here. The point isn't what we're addressing here. We'll talk about it. So it's good to know what it's saying, but this is not the main point of what this passage is trying to get across. But verse 28, but if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold, this is the land, shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. So the land is considered property. All right? Well, right before that, verse 23, what does it say? So this land that is his property, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, that means forever, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And this is Yahweh speaking. So Yahweh says, the land that is yours, that land is mine. So ultimately, they don't own, even what is called their property, for shorthand you could say, isn't really theirs. It's God's. And we have the foundation of Genesis, also written by Moses. The foundation of earlier in the Bible that says we're made in God's image. It says God created everything. And it says we're to rule the earth. And so we can see that we are supposed to rule it, but we're managers. We're not owners. And there's a way to use your authority correctly, and there's a way to abuse your authority, to abuse, right? If I work at a restaurant, I have a general manager, and there's certain things my general manager is well in his rights to say, do this, don't do that. But there's also things where my general manager can be abusive, and I can report to HR and say, hey, my general manager is doing this, and my general manager will then, get reprimanded, get fired, whatever the consequence is. But that's something where you have authority, legitimate authority, but it's not because you really, in an ultimate sense, own whoever, whatever. So here, God is saying he owns actually the land, and we're just taking care of it. And so that's the same thing here. When it says that this other person is an individual's property, it doesn't mean in an ultimate sense. It's not like how we think of it. We're very, very individualistic in America, and we think very differently of property. This person may be his property, but really this land, this person, whatever else, is owned by God, the Creator, and we are to take care. And we see this a lot less people have issue with children being under the authority of their parents, right? Absolute authority. Parents have so much authority. Now, of course, parents can still abuse the authority. You have child protection services that may need to step in on rare occasions. But in general, parents they have the absolute authority over their kids. They tell their kids, you're going to do this, you're not going to do this, here's consequences, whatever. But I don't really hear a lot of people going around on the internet, oh my goodness, I saw a parent telling their kid what to do today. Like, this is so terrible. This is at least not something that in principle is an issue. All right. So having one person have authority over another person, even massive authority, even almost an absolute authority, right? But even with parents, there's still some things you can and can't do. And even with an Israelite having a servant as a property, there's things you can and can't do. Exodus already talked about some of that stuff. If you knock your servant's tooth out, he's free to go. You abused him, he's not your servant anymore, right? You are to manage everything and everyone that God gives you in a particular way. And if you don't follow what God says, then you've lost that privilege of being the manager. And so here, that leads into our second part of this, which is ruthlessly. It says you can't rule over your brothers, the people of Israel, ruthlessly. And so you could read that as saying, then you can rule over these others ruthlessly, these other servants. Now, you've got the context. We're all made in God's image. You've got the context, Exodus, that you can't do these certain things or your servant goes free. There's definitely, we've already seen stipulations that seem to say that's not the case. That's not right. You can't rule over these other people ruthlessly. So the context does not seem to indicate that it is implying that you can. But then how are we to read this? Because it can very easily, if you just read through it, sound like that's an implication. Well, I think this is a good comparison would be if I got a couple of my kids, they're sitting at the table with a friend, and one of my girls shoves the other one out of the chair. Well, I'm going to go to her and I'm going to say, you can't do this. This is harming your sister. You need to care for your sister. You cannot do that to her. Now, as I say all this stuff, and I don't mention the friend, does that mean that I think it's okay for her to shove her friend out of a chair? Does that mean I think it's okay for her to harm her friend? Of course not. Of course, she still has to, she needs to treat her friend well too. But I'm talking specifically about her relationship with her sister there, because that's the context. Here in this context, we're talking about the Israelites. And so with that spiritual analogy here, the only way to have the eternal blessing is you must be redeemed. You cannot be redeemed if you're not part of God's people. If you go worship some other traditional religion or some other belief system, you're not part of God's people, then you are not you're not in this group that can be redeemed. You have to be part of God's people. It makes sense now that the Israelites, the covenant people, are the only ones that can be redeemed that it's talking about here. So you have people that are servants that are going to be passed on as servants to the next generation. They're not able to be redeemed, like from the year of Jubilee or all these different stipulations of how you can be redeemed. It's just for the Israelites, just for God's people, because only God's people get this freedom, because it points to the spiritual truth that only God's people can be spiritually saved, can have this year of Jubilee, this spiritual freedom. But that doesn't mean, when we go back to the physical right here, right now, in Leviticus, it doesn't mean that you can then ruthlessly abuse the other servants. And we've seen that previously in Exodus. We know that if we're thinking about what it means to be made in God's image back in Genesis. So if you're genuinely looking for understanding of this passage, I think part of the point that we can see here, aside from this big spiritual narrative we can see, is simply a lesson we can take. It's just looking at the context and seeing, is there a way this makes sense? Because there is a way that this can make sense where it's not saying to ruthlessly treat other people. Now, some people will not accept that. Some people just are determined that they would like to just look at this negatively, and that's their choice if they want to look at it that way. But there's definitely a way to look at this that does make sense in the context, make sense of everything we've seen in the Bible up to this point. Now, chapter 26, the next chapter we have, it's blessings and curses. It's here's you obey, here's the blessings, you disobey, here's the curses, which is kind of in a way reiterating what we just saw in all of this. Holiness, eternal judgment, eternal blessing, redemption, and then so that's this whole section here in chapter 25 has been talking about redemption of God's people. That's the point, that's the message, that's what it's getting at. And then chapter 26 says blessing and cursing. Now, we are going to talk about this more at length in Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy kind of talks about the same stuff, but in more detail. So we're going to put a pause on that now, and we're going to come back to it in Deuteronomy. So that wraps up our video. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's been informative, and that you have learned more about how it's pointing to Jesus. And next time, we'll wrap up Leviticus. Next time, we're going to talk about the last chapter. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word.